I am Andrea Johnson. I'm Senior Counsel for State Policy at the National Women's Law Center, which is in D.C. I get to work all over the country with amazing state advocates, so I'm very excited to be here in New England, and rain and snow cannot stop us. I'm from Minnesota, so I was just like, come on, we can handle this. Airlines thought otherwise, and that's actually why you have me here today instead of my colleague Maya Ragu, because her flight was canceled and she was not able to reschedule. But I am ecstatic to be here, because I love talking about equal pay, like all the time. And today I'm especially excited to talk about it because we have a panel of leaders here who aren't only state leaders on equal pay, but they are really national leaders on equal pay because states are leading the way on closing the wage gap. Like Congress, we cannot depend on right now. They have been stuck with gridlock around legislation that could close a lot of loopholes in our equal pay laws, but that's not happening. States is where it's happening. So if you bear with me, I want to ask you all a few quick questions. Raise your hand. So by a show of hands, how many of you have been asked for your salary history in the hiring or interview or negotiation process? Okay, wow, that's a fair number. And how many of you have either been prohibited or discouraged by your employer from talking about your pay with your colleagues? I always get like goosebumps whenever I ask these questions. And then how many of you know that you were paid less than a man doing comparable work? Wow. Okay. Sometimes I wish I could just take you all with me when I go and testify in front of legislatures about equal pay, and they're, male legislators will say there is no wage gap, it's just women's choices. And this is powerful because all of those questions represent practices that contribute to the wage gap. So, as I said, we have a federal equal pay law, the Equal Pay Act, that's been around for over 55 years, but pay discrimination continues to flourish because there are loopholes in that law, and because it does not reach some of the practices that I just asked you about, like being asked your salary history, which forces a woman to carry pay discrimination with her from job to job. I'm sorry for the scratchy microphone. And it doesn't adequately reach pay secrecy, which allows pay discrimination to remain undetected in the shadows for years, as happened with the famous Lilly Ledbetter in her equal pay case. She was paid significantly less than her male counterparts for decades and had no idea until somebody slipped her an anonymous note because Goodyear really discouraged discussing salary. So states are stepping up to fix these problems, and New England in particular is really stepping up. So you're doing all that you can do to close the wage gap because I think you all understand in a way that unfortunately is not being understood right now at the federal level by some legislators that your communities literally cannot afford to wait any longer to close the wage gap. So 38 states introduced equal pay legislation this past session, and the numbers have been about that high in previous years as well. And many states have their own equal pay law that's often modeled after the federal law, which means they might have loopholes in them, but states are taking steps to close those loopholes, especially around the employer defenses. States are also amending their laws to require equal pay for comparable work. So when I asked that question, I didn't say equal work. How many know they've been paid less than a man doing equal work? I said comparable work, because that's a standard that more accurately reflects our modern workplaces, where we have more specialized jobs, more digital jobs or service-oriented jobs, where two jobs might likely differ in small ways, but generally speaking, they are the same jobs, so they deserve equal pay. States are also increasing the amount of relief available to victims of pay discrimination to make sure that they're made whole for the injury they've suffered, and also that employers are incentivized to follow the law to begin with. And states are also amending their equal pay laws, which historically have been very focused on sex-based pay differences, to also include protections against race-based pay differentials. And this helps, for example, women of color who experience intersectional discrimination. So that's a really important movement we've been seeing in the states. And states are working to lift this veil around pay secrecy. 18 states and the District of Columbia have passed laws protecting employees from retaliation for discussing their pay. And some states are starting to look at legislation that would require employers to provide salary ranges to job applicants, so bringing more transparency around pay. And thanks to Massachusetts, which led the way with its bill in 2016, 7 states, including Vermont and Connecticut, now prohibit employers from seeking and relying on job applicants' salary history. So that dreaded question that I think we all kind of get at a gut level, how unfair it is. So if I had listed for you what states are making these changes, you would have seen that there's a strong New England theme. in those trends. And if we lifted the veil a bit further, we would have found that the women at the center of that change are the women on our panel. So we're excited to introduce Kate Farrar, I'm not going in order here, but with the Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund, Cary Brown, who's Executive Director of the Vermont Commission on Women, and Genevieve Nadeau, State Enforcement Counsel of the Office of Massachusetts Attorney General. So let's welcome them to start. Okay, so I'm going to sit down here, so we can have a conversation. But I'll start off by asking you, or mentioning that all of your states have made significant changes to their equal pay laws in the last few years. So can you give us a brief overview to start with of what those key reforms looked like in your respective states? Maybe you want to start?
Okay.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So Massachusetts was one of the first states to pass an equal pay law in the country. Sorry, I've got a little feedback here. In 1945. So we've been on the books for a very long time, and obviously with a very persistent gender pay gap. In fact, in the last year, it went up 3%. Sort of the wrong direction. So if ever there was a question about whether the need for this continues, it absolutely does. We can maybe get into more detail later, but as a result of sort of key court decisions, among other things, we saw very little enforcement under the law. It just wasn't very effective. This legislation that passed in 2016 and went into effect just this past July was many years coming. So there are many advocates and legislators who worked for 20-some years to get it through, and finally, sort of stars aligned in 2016. When I talk about the legislation, I sort of say that it did three sort of key things. One is that it updated and clarified what it means, at least in Massachusetts, to pay equal wages for comparable work. So we added some language and some clarity around what comparable work means, because one of the things our courts had done is really sort of gut what that means and returned us to really an equal work standard. So the legislation addressed that case law specifically and made clear, no, this is really a comparable work statute. Second, it was intended to tackle what we now know are additional barriers to closing the pay gap, and that's transparency and salary history in particular. And then third, we included an incentive for employer self-evaluations. I think we're the first, we might still be the only in the country that really has this kind of, right? Yeah. It's an affirmative defense for employers who conduct self-evaluations. Obviously there are parameters around it. It has to be conducted in good faith within a certain amount of time and reasonable in scope and detail. And then employers have to take steps to remedy any sort of gaps going forward. But the goal there was, this isn't just about creating incentives for more lawsuits. We want to close the pay gap, and what is that going to take? And we think we have a lot of employers who, willfully or not, don't realize they have pay gaps and aren't addressing them. And so how can we sort of nudge that forward? And so this affirmative defense that we created, I think we stole a little bit from the state of Maine, who has some sort of regulations on the books, as inspiration, and then went from there. So that, I think, is really the most unique part of the law. But those are the sort of three buckets that we really tackled in the legislation.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Farrar, and I am wonderfully here with colleagues today from the Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund. And I think one of the themes that is somewhat of the beauty, as was talked about state legislatures, is we really get to have this experiment with each other of what we're able to do, and if we're not able to do it one year, maybe one of our neighbor states can do it, and we can come back and use them as an example of why we really need to be doing it. And I would say that really has been the case in Connecticut. Several years ago, we did have gubernatorial leadership that came together in 2013 to have a task force of how the state of Connecticut could address equal pay. And that was a positive step for gubernatorial leadership to come together and do that. They produced a very shiny, lovely report of recommendations. And unfortunately, most of that report has just sat by the wayside. So if any of you are in Connecticut in the room, I encourage you, if you're not familiar with that report, kind of where we want to go is entirely charted out in this 2014 report of how we tackle pay equity. The one thing that did come out of that report that was successful at the time because of the governor's support in 2014 was passing legislation around the pay secrecy issue that was mentioned. So there was kind of that first step in Connecticut to readdress this issue, making sure that really employees didn't face any penalties around sharing their salary. You kind of fast forward a few more years, and there really took those several years of groundswell and advocacy on the ground to make sure that the leaders of the state didn't think that was enough to really close the wage gap. And 2 years ago, our organization, with several others in coalition, really tried to bring forward a bill that was pretty comprehensive in nature to what Massachusetts mentioned in 2016. This was 2 years ago. The first time we tried to do that, we received a significant amount of pushback from our business community, which is challenging to face in Connecticut when I know that in Massachusetts, there was ultimately business at the table to make it happen. We faced a more kind of conflict situation with the business community in Connecticut. And therefore, what happened the first time we really tried to kind of take the lead from a Massachusetts comprehensive model is we ended up getting passed in one house what we wanted, but it was going to be stripped down to what we didn't want in another house, and we decided to walk away from that legislative session. This was 2 sessions ago. Whereas this spring, what we did a little differently is from the outset, we really led the charge in bringing a bipartisan working group together. Rather than leaving it up to one party to take care of it, we initiated the work to bring that bipartisan group together and to really work out some of the differences on the front end. And also, we worked to bring some allies that we thought could be helpful in the business community in on the front end as well. And where we ended up was being able to pass comprehensively the salary history ban bill that we wanted, but we did not get the comparable work. We did not get the element that was mentioned about the self-audit. And for us now, that means, that we have to keep bringing those other pieces forward. But we did feel strongly enough this spring that the salary history ban in and of itself was a really important step. And there was, in our state, we're in a state of kind of a sense of, in the legislature, this feeling of the sky is falling with a fiscal crisis. And therefore, for us, in getting a salary history ban passed, it felt like a realistic step forward that we could make, and we didn't want to wait another year for that. And for us, the key to making sure this happened was leading on the front end with an actual bipartisan working group and trying to kind of organize that from the beginning.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Cary Brown from the Vermont Commission on Women. And in Vermont, we've been kind of chipping away at equal pay disparity for many, many years. We have a pretty strong equal pay law that was first passed in 1993, I think. Does that sound right? I'm looking at Marcia's the chair of our commission, so you were there at the time, right? But in recent years, we've kind of been looking at ways to refine that and to strengthen it and to see what needs to be added on. And so in 2012, our Attorney General's office took a really strong leadership role in hosting a conference that looked at equal pay in general, and out of that built this very, very broad coalition of everybody you could think of, and worked on, let's try to do a comprehensive equal pay bill that addresses everything that we want to do. And they started with this gigantic laundry list and winnowed it down and came out with a bill that passed in 2013 that included strengthening the portion of the law that talks about any factor other than sex, and changed that to any bona fide business-related reason other than sex is a justification for a discrimination, essentially. It also completed the pay secrecy part of our law. So we had a law on the books that you were allowed to disclose your wage information to someone else, but we didn't have the part that said you could ask your coworkers. So we added that in to kind of close that circle. We also included the right to request flexible working arrangements. And I think we were the first state to do this. And that was something that we thought was a really important piece to try to recognize the fact that so much of the wage gap has to do with women's disproportionate family responsibilities. Women are much more often the ones who are taking the kids to the doctor. They're more likely to take time off when somebody is sick. They're more likely to be the ones caring for aging parents. And so to try to kind of level things a little bit, and what we got was not the very strongest that we had hoped for, but it does mean that in Vermont you have the right to request twice a year flexible working arrangements. Your employer has to listen to that and has to discuss it with you, has to respond. They don't have to grant it. We spent a lot of time wrangling about that. So and there were several other sort of more housekeeping elements of that bill, and out of all the pages and pages and pages of that bill, that was the one where everybody wanted to spend their time talking, was that right to request. And that was where we had the most opposition. It was very interesting. And then in this past session, last spring, we passed the salary history ban. And so we're joining with more and more states on that one.
Thank you. I think a theme that we're seeing here is that there's not just one thing that will help close the wage gap, that salary history by itself, banning that question is not going to close the wage gap. There's all sorts of things we need to do to strengthen our equal pay laws, but also things external to those laws, like scheduling issues, like protections for caregivers that are really important to closing the wage gap. So I think that's so great that you're all coming back year after year, and there's some legislative appetite, political will, maybe depending on the year, but to come back and really continue to attack this, because it's not just a one and done thing. And we're learning new things. So I think that was an interesting point you made, Genevieve, about putting salary history in after you kind of learn that this was another thing needed to close the wage gap. So can you talk a little bit more about that specific provision? And again, this is not the silver bullet, but there's been a lot of media attention around it because it is a sort of intriguing idea of like, oh yeah, why am I being asked that question? Is it really a fair question? Is it the neutral question that businesses often think it is? And sort of where did that come from, that idea, and who was involved in bringing it to the table?
So, I think it's fairly intuitive why you have salary history provisions, right? Which basically, I'm sure everyone in the room knows, but basically, in some form or fashion, limit the ways in which salary history can be taken into account in setting future wages. I think some states have done it differently, and we have different nuances to our laws, but there's both the piece about asking about salary history, and then there's relying on salary history are sort of two main components. And we've tackled that in different ways. I think that, for many of the advocates in Massachusetts, was always one of the key parts of the law. And surprised me at times at how contentious that part was, because it's something that was very concrete, I think, that would require businesses to change specific policies and practices that they had in place. But for us, it was a key component of addressing this effect of women, sort of carrying disparities with them from job to job, and not only carrying, but sometimes increasing. And it's just a function of how we know many employers do business. There are economic incentives to pay people sort of as little as you can. And if you know two people are making, what they're making, and you sort of say, well, I'll add 10% on top of that just to incentivize them to leave their current job, that is going to perpetuate a disparity if there one exists, and there often is. And so we don't view salary history as a gender neutral factor, right? I know that's an argument out there that it's gender neutral. It's just what you made before. There's no discrimination intended. But we have so much discrimination, and intentional and otherwise, built in, sort of baked into our system, that's one way to address it. It's actually fairly simple, I think, but there was a lot of discussion and a lot of negotiation over that. And we did a little bit of compromising. So in Massachusetts, we addressed it specifically by prohibiting employers from seeking a prospective employee's salary history, really from any source, prior to making a job offer that includes compensation. right? So we sort of have taken it and sort of shifted the place and time, or right when salary history can be introduced into a negotiation. So that there is an option for employees to volunteer and to inject that into negotiations themselves. But we want employers to think about what a job is worth and make an offer first before they hear what the salary history is. And then second, although we don't have a per se prohibition on relying on salary history in setting wages, the statute does specifically say that it will not be a defense to any disparities that are found to exist. So between those two things, I think most employers are sort of getting the message that this is effectively off the table. So I think it's a really key piece of the legislation. I mean, time will tell how it all works out.
We've definitely seen, sorry to interject things, and I didn't really give an introduction to the Law Center, but we work on all sorts of policies that affect women and girls throughout their lives, from at home, at work, at school, reproductive rights issues, education, and I'm on our workplace team, and so I work with advocates in the states and legislators on a host of legislation, including equal pay, and I think equal pay is kind of one of my favorite things. It's just so fascinating to kind of look at how you can use the law to change employer behavior and where we can find, it's so hard to de-bias minds. It's a lot easier to de-bias processes, and so I think there's some really exciting work going on in the states around that, and so I could talk about this forever. So I'll try to keep my introductions to a minimum, but I will say that we are in response to your states passing laws, and states like California passing a salary history law as well. Employers are changing their practices, and some of it is just it's compliance, and they have businesses in multiple jurisdictions, and so they need to. And but a lot are speaking up when they change their practices to say, like, we are going to stop this company-wide across the country because we recognize it's contributing to the wage gap. So I think that's incredibly powerful. And so thanks for all the work that you're doing to get employers to kind of think about these things. But I don't know if Kate and Cary, you want to talk a bit more about why you decided to work on that specific salary history issue this year, and if were any interesting sort of allies that came to the table on this issue.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think ours was somewhat of a political imperative. We all just had an election 10 days ago, but in our state, until the election 10 days ago, we had a split Senate, 18-18, Republicans, Democrats, and we had a pretty tight House with just a smaller Democratic majority than had been seen in years. And what that meant for us to this point of likely not being able to unfortunately get the full bill that we wanted, that's why it really required us on the outset taking this very bipartisan group approach and really narrowing in on what we thought we could really kind of get past this year. And salary history, because of its prominence, I would say, in the news, because of its prominence in the Massachusetts bill discussion, was really front and center as the priority because of that. And for us, in making sure that we really did make progress kind of in the political environment we were in, that really made certain that this was what we were going to focus on. I think the challenging part of any part of kind of moving the needle with equal pay legislation, but it was very apparent, especially in the salary area of discussion, was this request from legislators and media alike saying, well, I need someone to come forward and tell me about this. I need a story. I need kind of women rushing forward to tell me about their experiences. And what's, I think, really hard about this issue in particular is we know, fundamentally that this is a very difficult and often kind of, especially in the case of where there might be cases pending for individuals or they have confidentiality agreements, you can't necessarily, kind of wake up tomorrow and ask women to come forward and talk about how they've been paid unfairly their whole lives. And I think with this issue in particular, it really kind of begs us to making sure to be thoughtful about how are we making sure that the voices of women of all communities are being heard when it is such a difficult and challenging issue for those individuals to come forward often. And I think that was often a barrier that we had in the discussions about this bill, because legislators in many ways think, if I have a hearing on a housing issue, I have all of these people coming and talking about housing. And sometimes it's really an education moment with those legislators to explain really the intricacies of why women, aren't in a position to do that with this issue. And that, I think, sometimes limits our opportunities to pass even broader and more sweeping legislation in this regard.
That's a really great point. That comes up in so many other issues as well, is that to try to get people to come and tell their personal stories is asking so much more than I think the people who are hoping to see that understand. So I just wanted to give Massachusetts a lot of credit for our law. True story, why it was first introduced was one of our representatives was driving in her car listening to the radio and heard a story on the radio about Massachusetts passed this law. And she thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. And she put in, introduced a bill. And it just sat there with nobody paying any attention to it for at least a year. And then something happened in the Senate, and somebody else got interested, and because there was already this bill kind of sitting there, they had something to work with, and so there was a long, complicated process. But that what ended up happening was our governor saying, "This is really important, and this has to pass," and that got everybody at attention and to work really quickly, and so then it was able to pass fairly quickly.
So an important part of laws is first getting them passed, but then also what happens afterwards, making sure that they're actually implemented. And that piece is often not followed through on. But Massachusetts, and I feel like I'm just singing all of your praises, but you have been leading on this issue in many ways. Massachusetts has issued some guidance around their equal pay law. So I'd love if, Genevieve, you could talk a little bit about that and why you decided to issue the guidance on the equal pay law and what were some of the key issues you needed to address in it.
Sure. So there's sort of a variety of reasons. We were, as an office, very involved in passing the legislation, and we're going to have a role in enforcing the legislation. And so sort of like in between that is getting, hopefully, employers to comply with the legislation. And the law actually gives us the ability to issue regulations. And so for a variety of reasons, we haven't, at least not yet, undertaken the formal regulatory process. I think this is an enormously complex law to try to issue detailed regulations on, because of so many different things that it covers. But for the same reason, employers also needed some guidance. So we sort of took the middle route of doing nothing or doing formal regulatory process. And so we have up on our website, which is mass.gov/AGO/equal pay, a pretty thick guidance document that we issued to answer some of the most commonly, sort of posed questions to us. And we did a lot throughout the process of sort of drafting the legislation and getting it passed, and then throughout the process of putting together this guidance, we had meetings with businesses, with plaintiff side employment lawyers, defense side employment lawyers, advocates. So we got a lot of input. And so heard not only what their questions are and what they thought would be most helpful for themselves or their clients, but what they thought the answers should be. And so a lot of work went into that. But because the law is complicated and, unfortunately for the first time, a lot of employers were paying attention to this issue, giving some information on what it all means, at least in our view, we thought was really key. Mm-hmm. So we did a lot of questions and answers. We also, because we have this unique affirmative defense for self-evaluations, put together as best we could a guideline for employers who want to undertake one, sort of what they should be considering and what basic steps to take. Mm-hmm. And then, we put up a website. There's a nice little video of the Attorney General. But trying to sort of not only provide useful information, because we will enforce the law. That's part of our role. But I think first and foremost, we view our role as educating about the law. Mm-hmm. So it's been a lot of work, but we're hopeful that it's worth it. Mm-hmm. So we'll see.
And are there any issues that you see ahead in implementation, certain aspects of the law that might be challenging, or things that employers have been raising at this stage?
Yeah, I think this affirmative defense there's probably going to be a fair amount of litigation to sort of flesh out the contours of it. But I actually think that even though some of us who do this work are very used to the term comparable work and what that really means, I think for a lot of employers, they are, for the first time, at least in Massachusetts, starting to think differently about their workforces and starting to compare and contrast jobs in a way they didn't do before. And so I think that sort of like figuring out what are comparable jobs for purposes of this law is going to be tricky for some employers. So I think that's going to be a big part of it.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about legislation, and actually kind of curious if we could get a show of hands of sort of how many of you are doing legislative advocacy? Okay, good. We got the audience right. Are there students in the room? What's kind of the breakdown here? And maybe you're also doing legislative advocacy. Okay, awesome. Okay, good. Well, that being said, now I actually would like to shift and talk a little bit about sort of non-legislative techniques that are being employed in the states and in New England in particular to close the wage gap. I think Cary and Genevieve, you both live in states that have some sort of equal pay pledge or compact for businesses, and I'd love you to speak to sort of what is the value of them, and do you feel they've been effective, and in what ways? Cary?
Sure, I'll start, although again, Massachusetts provided kind of the inspiration for us and leading the way, and the Boston Women's Workforce Council has this 100% talent compact that employers sign on. Is anybody familiar with that one? Some of you, okay. So employers can sign on, and it's a pretty comprehensive process that they agree to, where they're not only committing to taking certain steps to address the wage gap, but they're also providing wage information and anonymously. And then the project is analyzing that and really hoping to be able to see that wages are changing. And so we took that idea and thought, what's a version of that we can do in Vermont at the Commission on Women with our 3 staff who are already busy.
Good for you. Yeah.
And so what we've done is kind of the super light version of it, which means that we ask employers to sign on to what we call the Equal Pay Compact, and in the process we ask them to identify concrete steps that they're going to take to try to address not just the issues of wage disparity within their workplace, but in the society in general. And then we publicize their names and we give them lots of credit for signing on. So what we have found in practice is that because we don't have and we knew we weren't going to have the capacity to do this at first, and we were hoping we would build up to it, and we haven't quite gotten there yet, but because we don't have the capacity to do a lot of really in-depth conversations with them at the beginning about what does this actually mean? When we say equal pay, what are we really talking about? We find, one, that a lot of people think equal pay is very strict, equal pay for equal work, and so they will respond saying, I pay everybody equally at my workplace. Yay me. And and many of them do, but when we have the chance to talk with them more in depth, we can say, okay, so how about leadership of women at your company? How about your recruiting processes? Say, if that's all great, is there something you can do in your community that's encouraging women's leadership, or that's maybe bringing girls in to have a job shadow day or something like that? And so those are the kinds of things that we're hoping we at some point may be able to see a lot more of. But at this point, it's really, it's been very successful at raising awareness and raising the visibility of this idea that as employers, we care about equal pay, and we're willing to do a little something about it. And then it gives them all a little bit of a network with each other, and it also gives us a list of employers who are going to be friendly to other kinds of projects that other people are doing, because it's all on our website, so everybody can see who it is that can kind of help feed into some of that.
So I can speak a little bit, and I take no credit for this because it's the city of Boston that did this compact work, and it's the Boston 100% Talent Compact, which is part of the Boston's Women Workforce Council's work. But right, so it's essentially it's a voluntary program that I think now has hundreds of employers in the city, right?
It's like 200 to 300.
Right. And I think it started around the same time that our statewide legislation was being negotiated. So when I said sort of before that the stars aligned, I think this was a piece of it. So the city they didn't come on the legislative side, but on a more practical side in working with businesses who were a key part of getting the state law passed. But so what the compact does is it includes a data component, and it's really, I can't speak to it intelligently, but it's fascinating when I hear the city talk about it. Companies, provide data on their workforce. It's anonymized, so they're not sort of putting themselves up for, potential liability. And also ask participants to, I think, commit to at least 3 interventions. And there's a list of many different things employers might do to begin tackling gender disparities. And there are some really big name employers involved, and like I said, hundreds of them. I think the first time that they did a report, it focused on gender, but this last year in 2017, they added race as a component. So there's some really interesting data coming out of the city. It's a slice, right, because not every employer is participating, but it's a decent chunk. I think it's somewhere like 10 to 15% of the sort of Boston workforce, and it shows significant gaps. I think even larger gap than the statewide gap, if I'm not mistaken. But it's been really interesting, and like I said, really just sort of growing exponentially. And so I think I think that kind of effort is a really key piece. So legislation can do a lot, and I think sort of sets a floor. But I think legislation is most effective when it also sort of is part of or helps nudge cultural change. And I think our legislation does that, particularly around salary history and transparency, and a little bit of sort of pushing the envelope in terms of how employers think about jobs. But sort of socializing these things and the work that the city has done sort of at the same time, I think is really sort of key to actually closing the pay gap eventually.
So what Boston is doing is very exciting, and I think the points made about data and how important data is, and then also not necessarily trusting assertions made about data, that it's really important to kind of see the math as to how the numbers are crunched, and to break them down by race and gender, and there are different ways that you can kind of compare jobs to make it so maybe you don't have a wage gap, but if you did different kind of analysis, maybe you do have a wage gap. So some folks might be aware of the fact that the federal government, or under Obama, had proposed something called the EEO-1 pay data collection, which would have required employers with 100 or more employees to report pay data broken down by race and ethnicity and gender to the government on a regular basis as part of their EEO-1 form that they already have to file that lists demographic data. So this would just be taking that and adding to it compensation as well. And it wouldn't tell you whether or not somebody was, violating the law necessarily, because it was kind of a high-level, job categories and not specific jobs, but it would give senses of trends. And so it would have been really helpful information for the EEOC to have to kind of use their limited resources in the most effective way and do outreach and education and enforcement. Some of that data would have been made available to the public in an aggregated form, and that would have been useful for advocates to kind of see where trends are and where industries that are problematic. And unfortunately, it was quashed by the Trump administration last year, halted. And that is devastating loss, because this transparency, I think, is a theme in what we need to do to close the wage gap. It is sunlight is the best disinfectant, that whole thing, and being required to collect this pay data, as I think Boston has demonstrated, is a very useful exercise for employers to make sure that they're paying people fairly, to look at their books and see if there are pay gaps and then correct them, because I don't think we're necessarily ascribing malintent to these employers, but bias seeps in the pay setting process, and it's so important to regularly look at your books and make sure, are you really paying people what they should be paid given the job categories and everything, and if not, make those corrections. And so that initiative would have helped with that.
I was just going to say, I think the key to the Boston model, and I'm curious what happened in Vermont, but from what I know about Boston, what was critical to start this type of initiative was the work that was done with about 4 or 5 anchor employers in Boston to be the ones who signed on and led the charge. And I think, one of the things, just to kind of comment on the salary history dialogue that happens with that legislation, is in Connecticut, we would talk to, again, very large employers in in Hartford, who were already practicing the salary history ban, but they were not willing to come out and talk about it. And I think on this side of kind of the employers, you need several employers who are going to be those early adopters, who are going to be those leaders, and then that will follow. So I don't know if you saw the same thing in Vermont.
We did. And in fact, we initially partnered with the governor on this. And so one of the early adopters was the state, but then there were also several other really high profile companies that, like the Alchemist Brewing Company, which, has Heady Topper, which is like people think it's the best beer ever. And because there was that, it was a very small ask, small lift. A lot of other companies were eager to sign on because of that high visibility, and it's just kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah.
So are you looking to make other changes in the years to come to promote pay equity in your state? And what are some of them? Maybe it goes to this pay data piece that, as the federal government has stopped that initiative, states are now looking to see what they can do, either through legislation or through more voluntary employer-driven programs. Or is it something else? What is the new thing that's going to fix everything?
Well, I wanted to follow up on what you said about data.
Yeah.
So this is where we are really, really focusing very hard. So we're involved in a project called Change the Story Vermont, which is a partnership with 2 other organizations in Vermont that's looking at women's economic status. And we have done really extensive research on things like how much money women are making and what kind of jobs they have and what kind of education they're getting. And to get some of this data has been enormously difficult. And then there's a lot of other data that just isn't really out there. And so what you were talking about that the Obama administration was trying to do, that we have had several different bills in our legislature that have tried to get at that kind of information. In fact, one of the salary history bills included that in its initial form, and it got dropped. And so we're kind of trying to get agencies to do it on their own. One of the legislative committees last year said, well, we're not going to pass a law, but we'll write a letter to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development and tell them we want this kind of data. So not just about employment numbers, but also about what, when we spend money on workforce development initiatives or on economic development initiatives, who is benefiting from that? Where is that money going, and who's actually getting those jobs, and what kind of jobs are they? And the data by gender is there in many cases. It's just not really collected or reported on. It's certainly not reported on. And then to try to find it is an enormous research project. And so and some of it is not actually collected. So we're trying to figure out ways to get that on the books.
I would say, besides trying to kind of add the other elements that we've kind of had to let go in the 2 last bills that we passed, in Connecticut, our organization additionally leads the campaign for paid family medical leave. And we are now surrounded by wonderful neighbors who have all successfully passed paid family medical leave programs. And this year will be the 5th year of advocating for a program in Connecticut. The good news is that we have spent a significant amount of time during this election cycle to make sure that paid leave was the #1 priority of many of the candidates. And what it means now is that we have a gubernatorial administration that has put it at the top of their list. It means we have many new freshman legislators who won by talking about paid leave. And this means for us, fundamentally that we see this as kind of the #1 priority for women's economic security in the state, and really intricately tied to how we can address wage gap issues in our state too. So for us, we are kind of entirely focused on that when session starts in January. And for Connecticut, we certainly have many states to look to, but we're trying to make it, the strongest bill possible, so that, again, from the standpoint of kind of setting the stage for what other states can do, that we can make sure that we can be a higher standard, hopefully, in regards to how we define a family, if who can use paid family medical leave, that we're doing 100% of your pay when you're on leave, really trying to make sure that in this moment that we get the strongest bill possible to lead that charge.
I don't know that we have anything more on the immediate horizon legislatively. I mean, we've had a big couple of years in Massachusetts. So we passed paid family leave most recently, the Equal Pay Law. We also passed a Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. Yes. So, then that was intended to sort of bridge the gap between our sort of disability accommodation laws and gender discrimination laws and helping women at work get sort of basic, I think, accommodations and
Can I just say one
legal
quick thing?
protections.
And it's not just Massachusetts passing it. South Carolina passed the pregnancy accommodation law this year. So
Right.
you all are leading, and
Yeah.
you are convincing southern states and more conservative places that this is the,
It is. I mean, so that's not to say that there isn't more that we could potentially legislate. I think that the work we have to do, in addition to sort of implementing all of this and making it real, is really just about workplace culture. Obviously we have the Me Too movement, but we know, all of that. A big part, though, of the gender pay gap is lack of promotional opportunities, lack of women being represented in upper management. And I'm not sure that's something you can legislate, at least not with laws we don't already have on the books. So I think really addressing our workplace culture and all of that is, I think, one of the key challenges that remains ahead. And it's harder to point to the one thing you can pass or put into words to make happen. But I think that's where we're going to be focused.
Awesome. So I'm going to open it up for questions from our audience. Go ahead.
So thanks very much. I work in Boston, so I'm just curious. Can you speak up?
Do we have a microphone to?
Just stand up. Just stand up and share if you don't mind.
So I just have a question. Is there anything for employees to think about or onus on employers to put in their policies? Maybe an employee has been asked in the past, what was your salary?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're not now looking to leave the company, but they know that their current salary was influenced by that past question.
Right.
How is that being factored into the enforcement?
So what you're describing isn't necessarily illegal. I think where it factors in is, a couple of ways. If you currently have men and women performing comparable work and being paid unequally, all of the reasons why are sort of on the table. And there are only in Massachusetts very specific reasons that will justify, legally speaking, that gap, right? We don't have the catch-all any other reason, other than sex. So if it turns out that current disparities are the result of prior uses of salary history, those still violate the law. But I think the incentivizing the employer self-evaluation, where employers go back, see where there are disparities, and at least they should be trying to figure out why. I mean, that's part of figuring out whether there's a legal justification under the law, is sort of like re-engineering why do we have these disparities, where do they come from, and then using that going forward to sort of root them out. Because it's well and good to do a one-time evaluation, but you got to figure out what led to those disparities in the first place and make sure you're not repeating those problems. So I think that's sort of the best answer I can give you in terms of where there's a lot baked in already, right, to where we are. And so I think that's how those will get addressed.
Hi, good afternoon. So my question is, you said that some different companies signed on, just voluntarily to say, yeah, I'm going to give you this data to see that there's some equal pay going on. So when you get that data, whoever gets that data, what is done? Is that company, then somebody comes in and says, okay, so we looked at your books, and the white males are making this, the black females are making this,
Right.
the Spanish men are making, Hispanic people are making this. What are you doing, and what are you doing as far as what title you have in that company? Because all of that comes into play in the recruiting. So
Right.
when you're looking at that, and you're looking at that data, so you're looking at recruiting, you're looking at, okay, this is the same job, who's got this job, comparable pay, and if they're not doing it, what is done?
So I'm going to let you answer this. to some
Sure,
extent,
I'll
but
try.
But I am first going to just say the city of Boston has actually, they just
a whole report.
there's a report on what the data was, a little bit of how it got there, and what it showed. But in Boston, at least, it's anonymized. So which I think is part of the fascinating part. They worked with technology companies on how this was going to be, how the data was going to be supplied and
Right.
analyzed. So the city doesn't go back to a specific employer and say, tisk, tisk, you have disparities. It gets put into the pile and analyzed, and that's part of why employers
The
are willing to do
employer
it.
knows individually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So,
But it's not publicized.
but I would read the report. There's it answers
Yeah.
a lot of your questions for Boston, at least. But
Yeah, and I don't actually have any more to add to that about Boston. And in Vermont, we're not collecting that kind of data from employers. My hope is that we will at some point have the ability to be in a more consultative role with them to go back and talk with them about what's happening with the steps that you've taken, or can we offer any suggestions and resources and that kind of thing. But there isn't that specific method to hold them really accountable unless they're asking for that and they're looking for that on their own.
Is there a European model on this in some? I feel like
data?
Yeah, I know there was some data, and I know there was a story last year, I remember, in a European country about actually collecting data. I'll have to find it.
Yeah.
And actually doing something with individual employers, kind of on a public way, that in the United States I don't really see.
I mean, some countries require affirmative certification.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Of equal pay.
Of equal
I think
pay.
Yeah.
Iceland's probably the example of, I mean, you basically have to affirmatively prove on the front end that you are paying people fairly. And so-
Iceland, wasn't it Iceland?
Iceland, yeah.
Yeah, Iceland has that. You have to affirmatively.
Yeah, I mean, you
Yeah.
need to present, I think, on a regular basis your data and kind of show that you are not paying people, unfairly. And so, as opposed to the United States, we have very much a back-end approach where it's you have the right to go to court and bring a claim if you discover, which you might not ever, that you're being paid unfairly, and then it's litigated after the fact. Which kind of a simplified way of saying it, but I think so. Yeah, Iceland I think is very inspiring. The United Kingdom also implemented, I think just this year, went into effect a reporting requirement for employers to report out wage gaps. And the data that they report is very much at the high kind of aggregate level, and so I think it's maybe even just one number for like a whole company, which could involve lots of different jobs. But it's been really interesting to see the effect of this requirement. There's been a fair amount of media coverage of it, and employers have spent a lot of time justifying their gaps, which I think is a really good thing. That they're taking that time to be like, oh gosh, these are all the reasons that it's okay, but clearly, they're doing some deep thinking and maybe making changes, and it's, the very public aspect of it, I think, is highly incentivizing.
So do you see some disparities maybe between companies that are like strong union-based versus non-unions?
Well, I think that, we, not necessarily specifically in the companies that are signed up in the Vermont Equal Pay Compact, but we kind of
We
know
have that
across the
research.
board that there's much smaller wage gaps among unionized workforces. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unions themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, back there for a bit.
First, wait, don't tell me. Iceland has National Jealousy Day where they just publish everyone's data in case anyone's interested in a lighthearted policy.
I heard that.
Second, I was wondering if you guys could speak to how you sell the difference between equal and comparable.
Yeah.
Because I think in a lot of policy issues, it's easier to understand what equal means, but harder to get into the nuances. So I was wondering if you guys could talk to when you do try to push this legislation or pass it, how do you communicate
We weren't successful, so I don't think you wanna.
I think, well, we had a built-in advantage in that the law we had already said comparable, and we just sort of said that's not what this means. Like we're gonna take us back to what that word is supposed to mean. But I think some employers at least understand, especially in workforces today are not what they were in 1945 when the law was passed. They're much more complicated now, and to limit comparisons to really strictly equal jobs leaves an awful lot on the table. But I also think explaining a little bit of the history, right? So of comparable worth jobs, and we have not as much as we used to, but still have a very gender segregated workforce. And so explaining that context and that history and why we then have comparable work as opposed to equal work, I think people understand. I mean, whether everyone agrees and appreciates it is I guess, a different question. But I think sort of that historical perspective and understanding that comparable work, it's not truly comparable worth in the sense of what that means, right? So you're not going to be comparing, apples and pizzas, but maybe apples and oranges, right? So the law comparable is still reined in, I think. It still makes some employers uncomfortable, and then it's much broader than they're used to thinking about. So we had a lot of sort of practical discussions, but also some historical, contextual sort of explanations.
To continue your apple analysis, we often say that the equal work analysis is a Fuji to Gala apples analysis, whereas what we actually want is a apples to apples analysis, and that's what comparable work is. And it's very much a access to justice issue, because the fact is, people are going to court with the pay discrimination claim, and it's being thrown out very early on because the simple fact that they can't establish, their comparator is a valid comparator under the law. And courts are kind of nitpicking and saying, well, you both were managers, you both supervised, the same amount of people, you both had budget responsibilities, but you were managing the external affairs department and he was managing the communications department. So that's different subject matter. And so we're throwing your case out and we're not going to go even and look farther and kind of, so it's kind of basic fairness and access to court issue. And I mean, it's hard. I think employers often want really tangible definitions of what comparable work means, and it's really hard to define. But I think it's just kind of changing the frame of analysis, and so you're not looking at identical, everything has to match, but more so at kind of broadly, the degree of responsibility and supervision and the importance of the position in the company as opposed to the subject matter. And that's the best. That's the best I can do right now. And I think it's fair to admit it's. We're very happy that Massachusetts put guidance out, and I think a lot of this is best explained through examples. Yeah. And I think you had the powerful example of janitors and cafeteria workers in a school. Those kind of sound like different things, but they both involve kind of on the job learning, and I'm trying to remember the other things you mentioned.
That's actually the case that our state Supreme Court took on in the 90s. So female cafeteria workers, male janitorial workers, very gender segregated, and the wages were not just a little; they were vastly different, and no particular education level required, no necessarily prior experience required, same level of sort of skill, same level of physical effort, responsibility. All of that was very much the same, but one was dealing with sort of cleaning products and janitorial services, and other dealing with food and cooking. And given the vast disparities, that didn't go well in the 90s. The court sort of said, well, they're not exactly the same, and so we're not going to compare them under the law, and that's specifically the case that our new legislation was intended to address. So we include some examples. It's hard for the AG's office to give a lot of examples because we enforce the law, and doing it sort of in a vacuum and not in a real life situation can lead to unintended results. So examples are helpful, but that's where we struggled a lot in our guidance.
Sorry, I know you were next with your hand.
Hi, you've mentioned data several times, and I think data can be hugely influential. When you have data. So I want to know what sort of data is available, say, among the New England states, just to compare the New England states in terms of the wage gap. And is it available, say, by region, urban, suburban, and rural? How does that compare? And also comparing by occupations. And we could compare the governments, for instance. If private employer sources are unavailable, are there comparisons of government pay, gender pay gaps? And if I think to measure whether all these interventions you've suggested are effective, there has to be some way to measure. What was it before and what is it after?
I just would say yes. I don't know. It's I think fundamentally from the standpoint of making the point with data, as you said, the more localized the data could be, the more of a case it can make to a certain legislator or to a certain company. And I think sometimes when we use the most kind of the general data point of women versus men, not only are we losing the intricacies of how race and ethnicity fit into that, but to your point, we miss some of the very geographical realness of that. I know that some of the data that I've looked to over the years, we've been able to use at the congressional, at the legislative district level to make those cases. But I think to your point, if there's a way across state lines in New England to think about data sharing, I would love that opportunity, because I think, as you heard, we're all kind of struggling with the same data issues, and I think there's likely a better way that we can be thinking about our own data challenges right now.
And I would just add that I think that most of the data that you refer to, exists, but to look at it in the way that you're talking about it on a regional level, huge, enormous project that requires a lot of resources every time you do it. Yeah. And so then, 2 years later, when you want to go and see what kind of development there's been, it's another gigantic research project. And so that's something we really have to figure out a way to address if we can, within our own states, have it be more just automatically available. Then somebody who wants to go and look at 6 states can do it pretty easily, and we're a long way from that.
Hi, yes. Thank you for your comments. I have a question. Each of you have really spoken to how complicated this effort is, but I wanted to try to see if we could kind of take it a step further and talk about each of your policies and the efforts which you have been able to put forth. And what way does race and ethnicity play into what you're doing? Much of the data that we have has been able to talk about how pay equity is broken down, certainly by gender, but certainly by race and ethnicity. And I was just wondering, how does that inform the policy that you do, and how difficult is that work, and perhaps what can we do to ensure it is more intersectional and more inclusive?
Well, so this is something we're grappling with in Vermont right now, because when we look at the data that's available, we can't get it by race because the numbers are so small that they're considered statistically insignificant. I mean, other than white women, and so they're not reported anywhere. They're not available, and it's incredibly frustrating because it doesn't mean that there aren't actual people who who have jobs, and we can't get at that information. And so we're trying to figure out other ways that we can understand what the impact of this is. So we can look at national data, but there are reasons to think that there might be different dynamics going on within our state, but we don't know that yet. So we're really deep in that process of looking at other organizations in our state that are trying to address the needs of working women and of people of color, and to figure out how we can get at some of that, even if it's not, using census data, for instance, which is not available to us.
I would just comment on a slight commentary on how we led a little bit of the process with the bipartisan working group this year on the pay equity issue in Connecticut. Is one of the things that we were mindful of in instance of our organization, the Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund, is when we put together what was our women's economic security agenda this year. For the first time, I would say we really faced, kind of head on the white privilege of our organizational history, the white privilege of these issues historically, and we really led our our listing of our issues and a number of our kind of issue facts this year, with making sure that we were leading with really this element of race and ethnicity that sometimes gets put to the end of the list of these issues that we talk about. And for us, just by physically doing that in some ways, in the way we kind of broke down our agenda, it led us, when we were having conversations with legislators, to lead into this conversation with those data points rather than leaving them to the end of the conversation. What was interesting about that for us is in some ways it led to some newer and stronger relationships in the legislature with some legislators of color who were not as active on these issues before. We certainly have a long way to go in regards to representation in our legislative bodies of people of color. But for us, we really saw that it was important to us to kind of change how we led in talking about the facts of pay equity, and just as simple as often in our organization, we would highlight Equal Pay Day, which we still do, but now, we really highlight and have a plan communications-wise for each day specific to highlight, the Native American women's pay gap, Latinas, Black and African American, Asians, and really trying to make sure that there's these distinctions and bringing forward those stories, because I think when you kind of take those steps, it can make sure that we're not only making sure that we're leading with that very, very relevant story that people don't always think of when they think of the pay gap, but we're also making kind of these relationships with legislative allies that didn't necessarily have this at the top of their list. And I share that just as an instance of, us kind of in this learning process of what more can we do? What more can we continue to do to make sure that, from a standpoint of who is most affected by this issue is, kind of front and center in talking about it.
I'm glad you asked the question, because I think actually making the issues of intersectionality and race a part of the conversation is really important, because it's really easy to talk about the gender pay gap as a sort of monolithic, sort of one-dimensional problem, and it's clearly not. And so when I do my sort of like full presentation on the law, we talk about this a little bit, and like people's eyes sort of bulge when we talk about the numbers, of Black and Hispanic women as compared to white men, being so much worse than the overall pay gap. Unfortunately in Massachusetts, our law is solely based on gender. The issue of race did come up during the legislative process, and we didn't get there. We ended up, there's in the legislation a provision for a commission to study issues of pay equity and solutions around other demographics. And so that is just sort of getting off the ground, to be honest. So there's some hope there that group will do something more intentional and concrete about this issue, but I think you've identified sort of like one of the sort of big picture issues that we still have to grapple with. Some states are doing it by adding race in addition to gender in the law, and Massachusetts hasn't gotten there yet, but maybe we will.
I think it's important for us when companies are, as was said before, kind of announcing their pay gap and whether or not they have one, to make sure that they're not just saying we have no gender wage gap, that they are breaking it down by race, because that could mask a whole bunch of things, like where are Black women in your company, and so that's always pushback. When those announcements come out, like how are you using intersectional data here, because it's not just enough to say we have no gender wage gap. That's not the full story.
Give Boston credit for adding the sort of issue of race as another dimension in the data that they've put out, but I think it's just a gradual process.
Mm-hmm. I saw another hand over here.
So, related to the Vermont Equal Pay Act, you talked about a network of companies that are doing this work together. Can you share a little bit about the successes of that network, how they're leveraging their resources together, how they're sharing best practices, and sort of some takeaways from that?
Yeah, so that's really in its kind of nascent stages, actually. And so it's much more informal than if I had all the resources in the world and all my dreams come true. We would be having, and we've talked about ways to do this, bringing them together in person, having a breakfast, or having maybe even a whole full day with them, so that they can actually talk with each other and share their resources. But we do have another project that we're a part of that's called the Business Peer Exchange, and this is in as part of this Change the Story initiative that we're partners in. And so this is an ongoing, much more deliberate kind of program where it's maybe like a dozen companies, maybe around 15, that meet monthly for an entire year. And they send high-level members of their organizations, often their HR heads, and they really look very in-depth at ways that they can change their recruiting practices, ways that they talked about sexual harassment. They are looking at how to get younger women in their promotion practice, all those kinds of things, and being provided with really concrete strategies, and then learning from each other and supporting each other. And so that's the way that we're doing it on a limited basis, and we're hoping that that's going to expand to other parts of the state in the next year, and I think it's a really promising model.
Great. I think we have to wrap up. Am I right?
I would just like Cary to say one thing about the champions thing that Melinda put together.
Oh, the Champions for Change?
Yeah.
Yes, so this was an event that brought men together to talk about, to try to get them energized to carry some of this water as well. And it's actually kind of similar to what Tarana Burke was talking about this morning is, maybe we don't have to do all of this work. Maybe some other folks can kind of step up and do this. And so this was brought together intentionally men of influence in the business community largely, but also in government, and to kind of help them be ambassadors and kind of carry this word. So we'll see what happens with that in the future, but they were thrilled to be there, and I'm hopeful that they'll carry that energy out into the community.
So I just want to thank our panelists for their comments, but also the work that they're doing. You are providing strong models for the rest of the country, and I think I said earlier that you're convincing some other states. I don't know about that, but you are providing strong models that provide good examples, and we're seeing more conservative states becoming also very impassioned about equal pay and looking to some of the models that you all have worked on, equal pay and other issues, and that's really inspiring. So I want to thank you for your work that you're doing, and excited to see what's coming down the pike. So thanks.
Thank you.